Thank you for being here. I want to say thank you to all the parents and the families who came for dedication day. We're so glad that you're here. My name is Dave Edwards. I'm the pastor of discipleship here, and this has been the great honor of my life to get to be a part of this church and to see what God is doing in relationships. You know, what we're doing in discipleship is we're asking people to meet together one-on-one, pray together, read the Bible together, and live it out. And so that's our hope, is that you'll do that in some context, in some way. And if you need resources, we have them for you. So if you don't know, I want to take a minute to catch you up in my own life. I'm getting married soon. That's right. There is a God, and this is like that book of Acts, signs and wonders and miracles had taking place. And her name is Caroline. She's right over here. Give us a little wave out, Caroline. There she is right there. So say hi to her when you see her. And so we're getting married in December, so it'll be quick. And so I thought I would be a bachelor to the rapture. You know what I'm saying? Anyway, so it looks like I'm not going to be. I'm very happy about that. And so this morning, I'm going to read us a couple of verses out of 2 Timothy chapter 4. Now, if you have a Bible, you can look it up. If you have a pretend Bible on your phone, it's on there as well. If you don't own a Bible, if you look at the seats right in front of you, there should be a Bible right under the seat in front of you. Pull that out. And if you don't happen to own one, that's our gift to you. Just take it with you and use it. We want you to read it. We teach the word here. This is what we do. We take scriptures and we open it up and we say, God, what are you saying to us? And then we try to figure out ways to live it out as best we can. And so this is a powerful text because 2 Timothy is the second letter written by Paul. And as Paul's writing this, he is an old man. He's done most of his ministry is behind him. And you have to imagine a man penning out this last letter. Once you get to 2 Timothy and you find 2 Timothy chapter 4, if you just take your thumb and just run your thumb over that page and imagine that being a letter. It wasn't originally a book. It was a letter that Paul wrote to a young minister that he was discipling and mentoring and bringing up in the ways of leading a church. And now Paul is late into his life. He's in a dungeon. And so it's with shaky hands and wrinkly knees and blurred vision that he pins out one more letter to his mentor to challenge him to keep moving forward. And this is where we pick this up. This is what he's saying and writing to Timothy. You got it, 2 Timothy chapter 4. We're going to look at verses 6, 7, and 8. Well, here we go. Look at this. For I'm already being poured out as a drink offering. Paul's saying, I'm going to die soon. I'm in that season. Look at it. And the time of my departure has come. He can sense it, that it's closing in on him, that death is creeping up the windows of the cell, and it won't be much longer. Verse 7. I fought the good fight. I finished the race. I kept the faith. And in the future, there is laid up for me a crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award me on that day, not only to me, but also to all have loved his appearing. Paul had been through his seasons. He had his season. The spring of his life was when he met Jesus on the road to Damascus. The summer of his life was his first, second, and third missionary journeys in which he spent most of his time writing what he would be writing what would be part of the New Testament and starting churches. And then the fall of his life when he was arrested, not just once, but twice. And now in the winter of his life, the time of his departure, Paul had moved through the various seasons, and in every season, he had followed Jesus. No matter what the season brought, he had figured out a way to stay faithful and to follow the Lord. This is what he's saying to Timothy. Timothy, I know you're in a different season than what I'm in, but in the season you're in, I want you to follow the Lord. And all of us this morning are in different seasons. Some of us says for parents to dedicate their children, it's a new season. It's a new season. For some of us, you're grandparents, and it's a new season. Some of us are students and young adults, and you're in your own season. And regardless of the seasons in which we are living through currently, the single goal for all of us is that we figure out how to follow Jesus in the season that we're in. Paul had been a follower for all the seasons. And this is important because it's the seasons of our life that shape us. It's the seasons that we move through that turn us into somebody. And so Paul, when he says, I'm already being poured out as a drink offering, he's saying, I know what season I'm in. The time of my departure is near. Paul says, I know what season I'm in. And so the question this morning is, what do we do with the season that we're in? How do we follow Jesus in the season, whether we're young or old, or no matter what's happening in our life, whether it's medical issues or problems or successes, in whatever season we happen to be in, how do we follow Jesus and stay faithful in that season? And that's what these verses answer for us this morning. Now, I'm a note guy. All my points today, kids, start with the same 3 letters. They're all highly alliterated, so usually 1 letter is pretty good, but 3 letters alliterated at each point is bonus points for me. All right, so if you are used to taking notes on your phone, you might want to write this down. These are the 5 things that all of us need to be doing in every season of our life, young or old, successful or struggling. These are the 5 things we need to be doing. Here we go. Number 1, the first thing is that we need to resolve to leave it all on the field. Now, me using a sports metaphor is a little ridiculous because I struck out in kickball, all right? And so, but I like this metaphor because it says that regardless of what happened, I gave it my all. Like, this is what Paul's saying. Now, look at this. For I'm already being poured out as a drink offering. For the pagans, when they would finish their dinner, they would take the last cup and whatever was in it, they would pour it out as a way of saying it was finished. In the service of the tabernacle, for the believers, they would fill a silver chalice with wine, and they would take it and they would pour it out before the altar. And Paul says, I'm being poured out. I've given everything that I have, but I still have something left in me to give. I'm not going to die with anything in me. I'm going to leave it all in the field. I'm going to leave it behind. When he says I'm being poured out, he's saying there's still something in me that God wants to get out of me, but I'm going to have to be turned way up like this. I'm going to be turned way up in order to get that last drop out. Paul had been faithful to the last drop. At the time that he's writing this, he had only 3 possessions in the entire world. And he asked for them. Look at verse 12. Look what he says. And when you come to me, bring my cloak, my books, and my parchments. Paul had left behind his tent making business, left behind his 200 employees, left behind his status, his academics, and put it all on the field for Jesus. And at this point, he had these 3 things that he asked for, the last 3 remaining possessions of Paul. And Paul says, I count all that other stuff lost that I may know Jesus and serve him. In this season, I'm going to make sure that I leave it all in the field, that I'm not going to hold anything back. I'm not going to reserve faithfulness for another time. I'm not going to reserve my act of being loyal or being devoted to the Lord for some other season and think, well, when I get to a different season, I'll do it. When things are less complicated, I'll do it. When things are less chaotic, I'll do it. Paul says, no. I'm going to do it now. And in whatever season you're in this morning, the first choice is to say, you know what? I'm going to resolve to get out of me all of my faith and all of my loyalty and all of my devotion to the Lord. Paul had given it all. Do you see it? This is such a powerful thing because he gave it all for the gospel. It was for the sake of the life and the presence of Jesus that he spent his life. And there's something about the gospel generates generosity. The gospel is what, when we give our life to it, it makes us say, I don't care what I have to give up in order to live for Jesus. It doesn't matter to me what I have to leave behind or what I might have to give up. It's not even close in comparison to following Jesus. It's the gospel. When we grab onto it, it generates in us a spirit of generosity to give our effort, to give our energy, to give our time, to give the things that we love and to say, I'm going to invest it in the Lord. I'm going to make sure that whatever season I'm in, that I resolve to leave it all on the field. Paul says, don't stop me. I'm not going to go back. I can't hold back. I'm not going to quit now. Whatever season you're in your marriage, you have to say, you know what? We're going to pledge to give it everything we got. We're going to give all our faithfulness, all our loyalty, all our resources, whatever we got, we're going to pour it into what God is doing. That's what Paul had done. And he said, I never regretted it. I never regretted it. Because our words our work, and the ways that we live will all be left behind. You can't save faithfulness for a rainy day. You can't save up loyalty for some other time. We have to say, you know what? I'm going to resolve to leave it on the field. I'm going to give it my all so that in my last, I'll still be good to the last drop. You see it? Not only that, but number two is that we have to remain loyal to the Lord of the fight. We have to remain loyal to the Lord of the fight. Look what he says. I'm already being poured out as a drink offering, and the time of my departure is at hand. Now look at verse 7. I've fought the good fight. Paul didn't fight every fight that came his way. He fought the good fight. Some fights take our energy. They tax our resources. They tax our imagination. And Paul said, what I gave myself to was an attractive fight. It was a winsome fight. It was a fight that was worth fighting. And he says, as he's writing this, he's saying, I remember my loyalty to the Lord of the fight. I fight because Jesus fought for me. We fight in this life because Jesus fought for us. You see it? So we fight in the circumstances, in the midst of doubt and insecurities and uncertainty. We fight and we keep fighting. That is the good fight. Let me see if I can frame it in a way that we can all understand it. We fight because Jesus fought for us. Think about it. I always heard that love was stronger than death. People always say love is stronger than death, but it always looks like death wins. Every prophet, priest, and king that came onto this world, that wrote scripture, that prophesied in the name of God, that led in godly manners, no matter how godly they were, they still died. No matter how faithful they were, they still died. Noah still passed away. David still passed away. Every prophet, priest, and king, no matter how much they loved God, they still passed away. And still we hear that love is stronger than death. But love had had enough of it. It had had enough of seeing its faithful people pass away. And one day love entered into this world and rolled up its sleeves and said to death, death, I'm not going to let you bully people anymore. And like two gladiators, love and death entered into a ring, and they fought, and they went into a head-to-head collision match with each other. And they fought all over Jerusalem through the life and the ministry of Jesus. And they fought all the way up to Calvary, and they fought all the way up to the grave. Jesus went to the cross, and death said, see, I won. I did to you just like I did to everybody else. And all of hell partied. They partied all night Friday. All the demons and all the sickness and disease and war and pestilence, they all got together. And they threw a big party, and it was a late party, a long party, one of those parties where everything gets out of control. They partied all night Friday and all night Saturday. They thought they had won. But on Sunday, the stone was rolled away. And love stepped out of that tomb. And it took away the sting of death. And it snatched death out of the jaws of defeat. And Jesus rendered death and took away the sting of death once and for all. Colossians says, having nailed it to a tree and taken it out of the way. And so now on this earth, in our seasons, we fight because he fought for us. We remember the Lord of the fight, and we say, I'm not fighting just for myself. I'm fighting from the victory that he's given me. I'm fighting from the fact that he overcame death and that he overcame separation. And so when my marriage begins to splinter, why fight? We fight over hospital beds, and we pray for the deliverance of family members and relatives, and we fight in the midst of insecurity and doubt and uncertainty, and we say, I'm going to fight because he fought for me, or I remember that he took the sting of death. And so now, regardless of the season, we remember the Lord of the fight, and because he fought for us, we continue to fight faithfully for him. This is how we do it. Nice. All right. And then number 3. That was just the second point. All right, so we have to resolve to leave it on the field. Number 2, we have to remain loyal to the Lord of the fight. Even though times get tough and times are uncertain, we keep showing up. we keep showing up. I talked with someone this week that was married for 72 years. They lived through all the seasons together. I said, what was the secret? They said, we just kept showing up. We kept showing up. This is how you win the fight, is that you keep showing up. And then number 3 is that we have to reflect on the lessons of the finished season. We have to think about what we've learned. I don't know if anyone has ever challenged you to I think we move from one season to the next and go, that's over. Oh, that's done. They're out of grade school. They're in middle school. They're out of middle school. They're in high school. That's done. And I think we have a tendency to rush through seasons without really thinking about it. Look what he says. I fought the good fight. I finished the course. Paul didn't say I won every fight. He just said I kept showing up. He said I fought it. I fought it because he fought for me. Look what this says. Then he switches metaphors and talks about our life as a race. And he says, I finished the course. I finished it. As Paul was writing, an old man writing to this young man, he reflects on what he had learned. And in the seasons of our life, we have to stop long enough to say, what have I gotten out of what I've lived through? What have I learned as a result of this? If you're taking notes, I want to give you 4 areas or 4 themes that you need to have learned out of the seasons of your life. Paul said, I learned about the preeminence of God, the throne of God. When he writes in Colossians 1 that Jesus is above all things and before all things and in all things that were created and all things came into creation through him, Paul never forgot that he lived his life under the great throne of Jesus. His whole life was scaled by the fact that Jesus was on his throne. And in every season, regardless of whether he was in prison or out of prison or standing trial, or regardless of whether he was being beaten or shipwrecked or bitten by a viper, he always looked at the throne and remembered that Jesus was above it and over it. And in the seasons of our life, what have you learned about the throne of God? Have we scaled our life according to the greatness and the bigness of the rule of Jesus? Not only that, but then B, the power of God. The power of God. Paul's encounter with Jesus on the road to Damascus had changed him forever. He was thrown from his horse and blinded by the light of Jesus and heard an audible voice and was overcome at that moment by the power, the life-changing power of Jesus, and he never got over it. And for Paul, the power of Jesus was held within it the ability to overcome every struggle and every stronghold and to overthrow every type of doubt or uncertainty and insecurity. For Paul, it was the way that he was able to make peace with his past and push forward. Paul in his previous life had been a professional Christian killer. Before he met Jesus, he was killing Christians and setting churches on fire. And for Paul, the power of Christ was what set him free from all of that. Free from those negative instincts, free from addictions. So in the seasons of our life, what have we learned about the throne of Jesus? What have we experienced about the power of God? When Paul writes in Romans 1, he says, for the gospel is the power of God unto salvation. That Paul had experienced himself, that Jesus was able to save the most unlikely of people, meaning Paul. Paul in 1 Timothy calls himself the chief of all sinners. And yet he was able to experience this life-changing, transformative salvation of Jesus. In the seasons of our life, we have to think about the preeminence. We have to think about his power, and then we think about the passion of Jesus. Paul could almost not write about anything else other than the love of God. You read through his epistles, and they're laced with the love of God. The great chapter of Romans 8 when he says, who shall separate us from the love of God? Neither height nor depth. Nothing can get between us and the love of God. That it's unconditional and unyielding. And it keeps reaching after us. And Paul, in every season of his life, the spring and the fall and the winter and the summer, had always experienced the great, deep, abiding love of God. And then finally, D, the prerogative of God. The prerogative of God, which means Paul knew that his life was not his own. that God had a right to direct him and to take him wherever he was, that wherever he needed him to be. That for Paul, he said, God, you give me the assignment and I'll go. God, you have the prerogative, the say so. You have the right to call the shots. I know pretty well how to direct my own life. I know how to schedule my day timer and know how to put appointments on calendars. But God, you can override that. You take me, you lead me. This is why when Paul writes in Romans 12 that we should be living sacrifices. Paul has said, I've taken my mind and my body and I've yielded, I've given it to the Lord, that I'm living my life as a sacrifice in whatever season we're in. These are the things that we need to be able to know about the Lord, about his preeminence, his power, his passion, his prerogative. This is such a powerful thing that in Acts 27, Paul is on a ship that goes into an incredible storm. Not just a windy place, but an incredible storm where everybody on board thinks they're about to die. And they throw over cargo and they throw over stuff. They're just trying to survive. Even the seasoned sailors were frightened out of their minds. Near the bottom of that story, it says that they dropped 4 anchors over the boat to steady it. Normally, 1 anchor would just hold the boat in place, but 4 anchors, 1 on each end of the boat, was not just to keep it from being capsized, but to keep it from swinging because of the currents. And these 4 things in Paul's life became the 4 anchors that held him steady when he was in prison. It held him steady when he struggled. It held him steady when he had conflicts with religious leaders. It was these 4 anchors that didn't just hold him in place, but it kept him from swinging by the currents. And we live in a culture in which we're constantly being battered by the currents of morality, the currents of ethics, the things that are changing and shifting in our society, that for many of us who look at it and go, I never thought I'd see the day that this would happen. And so that we don't get thrown off course, and so that our vessel, our life doesn't swing with the currents, we drop these 4 anchors in place and we say, I'm going to live by his preeminence, that my life is under his rule, it's under his throne. We drop the anchor of his power and to say, whatever I need, whatever I got to push through, I know that he fought for me and he's given me the power to live through this. I'm going to drop the anchor of power on my vessel to hold it in place. I'm going to drop the anchor of love and know that I'm unconditionally loved by him. And I'm going to drop, that's right, you can clap for that. That's right. I'm going to drop the anchor of the prerogative of God and know that my vessel belongs to him. It's these 4 anchors that keeps us in place. It keeps us from being victims of the culture. And so in our young season, and in the summer of our life, in the spring of our life, in the fall of our life, and in the winter of our life, we say, I've set these anchors in place. You see it? If the sea could talk, if we could hear the waves and hear the sea talk, we'd hear the sea say, I've used my power to sink oil tankers. I've used my power to break glaciers in half. I've used my power to capsize vessels. But the waves would say, there's one thing I've never been able to overcome. There's one thing I've never been able to set a fire to. And that's a life who's faithfully anchored in the life of Jesus. That's where our life has to be. That's where our family has to be. That we take these 4 anchors and we set them deep into our soul. And no matter what happens in the culture, no matter what people decide, we remain anchored. Steady in the storm, steady in the current, unable to be swung about by what is happening around us. It's the greatest thing you can do for your life, is to set these anchors in place. It's the greatest thing you can do for your marriage and your family, is to say, we're going to have our household anchored by these 4 things. You see it? What a powerful thing. So as Paul's writing to Timothy, look at it. He's saying, we have to resolve to leave it on the field. We have to remain loyal to the Lord of the fight. We have to reflect on the lessons of the finish and think about what we're learning from it. And then number 4 is that we have to recommit to live faithfully. We have to recommit to live faithfully. Every now and again, in every season, we'll have to make this new decision and say, you know what? I'm going to keep being faithful. Look what he says. I fought the good fight. I finished the course. Look at this. I've kept the faith. I've often heard this read and thought, well, maybe he means that he just stayed in faith. That somehow he kept the feeling of faith up, that he just encouraged himself. But that's not what this is talking about. This is about the content of faith. Paul says, through all the seasons of my life, I kept the content in faith. I kept the content of the faith intact. Think about runners. Think about marathon runners running around a track. And as one is holding the baton and comes up behind the other one reaches back for the baton. The baton is the gospel. The baton is the faith. It changes hands. It changes. It moves from person to person and culture to culture. But the content stays the same. And Paul says, regardless of what I went through, I maintain the content. In every season, he committed and recommitted to keep living faithfully to the Lord. This is what makes the church powerful. What makes the church powerful is the content of the gospel. Think about it. We believe that Jesus is the unique Son of God, that he became man. He broke into this world. He lived a perfect life. He died on the cross. He disarmed the principalities and powers. They placed him in a tomb. He came back to life. He ascended to be seated at the right hand of God, where he's ruling and reigning today. And at his ascension, he released the Holy Spirit. He gave us his Spirit and sealed us with it and gave us the ability to walk with God and to hear God. And because of his life, his death, his burial, his resurrection, we're here today. That is the power of the gospel. That is what we commit to. So we say, every now and again, I have to remind myself that this is what I'm doing. Let me tell you why this is such an important thing. Because one of the predictions that we would be moving into the last days is that people would start to collect preachers that would just say things that we wanted to hear, that would just say things that would play to our own prejudice and our own ideas of how we want to live, our own luxuries, that would never challenge us. That people would pull false teachers around them to hear them say what they want to hear. And Paul says, we're not having any of that. I've kept the faith. I kept it intact. And everywhere I went, in every season, I proclaim that Jesus, the Son of God, that he died on the cross and that he rose again. I have kept the faith. And if the church doesn't keep the faith, we're a generation away from extinction. And so in every season, in every family, we have to keep the faith, to keep the content of the faith intact, to keep it rich and buoyant, and to continue to speak about Jesus and to tell people who he is and what he's done. You see it? This is nothing to be trifled with. This is nothing to be edited or compromised or reduced. That as Christians, we keep the faith. We keep the content of the faith. We keep the doctrinal purity of the faith. And we continue, when we talk about the faith, we talk about Jesus. When we have good conversations that lead to God conversations that become gospel conversations, we keep the faith by presenting Jesus as he is, his life, his death, his resurrection, his ability to change someone who would simply believe in him. Paul says, I kept that faith. I kept it intact. And then finally, number 5, is that we have to refocus. We have to refocus on loving forward. Look what he says. Look what he says. In the future, there is laid up for me a crown of righteousness, which the Lord of righteous judge will award me on that day. Let's be clear about this. Paul was using this idea of, in the games that in his days when they would compete, that the winner got a crown because of how they competed. This is not Paul saying that I'm going to earn my salvation and one day God's going to give it to me. Righteousness is about how we order our life. Righteousness is about the way that we live. Our salvation is secure. Our service happens here. Our salvation is secure because of who Jesus is and what he did on the cross and the fact that he's alive. Our service happens here. So Paul says, I know that one day that God will compensate me for everything that I've given away, for every sacrifice that I've made. I know there is a crown laid up for me. based on my faithfulness and how I live down here. I know my salvation is secure. This is not about earning your salvation. This is about how we live. And so he says, because of it, look at the rest of this verse. Look at this. Will award me on the day, not only to me, look at this, but also to all who have loved his appearing. You see it? That's all of us. There's a crown laid up for us. That's the incentive. We say, God, I'm going to live faithfully down here because I know that you're a righteous judge and you're coming back. And so my anticipation of Jesus' return is my motivation. Whatever I'm going to do, I got to do it now. My anticipation of the return of Jesus is my motivation to live faithfully. I know he's coming back. Because of it, I got to live faithfully. In other words, whatever you're going to do, do it now. If you're going to forgive someone in your family, forgive them now. If there's ever a time to let go of pettiness, it's now. If there's a sermon you're going to preach, preach it. If there's a mission someplace in the world you want to go do missions, do it now. Because the time is short. Paul says, I'm being poured out presently, and I know in the future that God's going to reward me for it. And so Paul says, my present is being dictated by the fact that I know Jesus is coming again. Time is short. Whatever you're going to do it now. If you're going to give your life to him, do it now. If you're going to return to him, do it now. Paul says, I'm not going to waste any moments. Whatever open door there is, step through it. Whatever opportunity you have, take it. While you got people with you, tell them you love them. Forgive them. Make the household right. Because one day, the Lord will return. And while we have time, while we have breath, we have to commit to saying, I'm going to commit to loving Jesus. I'm going to love forward. And whatever he calls you to do, whatever it is in front of you, do it. Do it now. Don't miss your moment. All right, let's pray.